My talk is called Community Reboot, a career change in 3 cups. My name is Monica Ayhens Madon, and I am the Ubuntu Community Representative at Canonical. And first, got to warm up the kettle a bit and give a bit of a background to where I was before this. I've always excelled in academics, anything school, and kind of traditionally hadn't done as well outside of that. I have 2 3/4 degrees. My bachelor's is in ancient Greek. My master's is in maritime studies, and I have 3/4 of a PhD in history, but I left towards the end of my program shortly after meeting my husband. It wasn't a causal thing, but I had been realizing even before I met him that I kind of went into the program because academia was my safe space, but it wasn't a very comfortable one. And so after I left to see kind of what was out there, I still kind of kept clinging to academia. And I worked as a tutor freelance while I was waiting to find whatever job was going to come next. Now, my husband and we got married in 2016, and my husband was and is an autodidactic Linux nerd and who got a position in cybersecurity in 2017. And this meant that we had to move from Alabama to Atlanta for his job. And I figured that this would be good. We were living in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, about 100,000 people. Atlanta is slightly larger, and I thought that there would be more jobs to be had. The first job I found, however, was still as a part-time writing tutor, albeit at the community college right across the street from him. And I kept on trying to get better academic jobs. I went for academic advisor positions. I went for tutoring center directors, but nothing was happening there. And it was really frustrating to be kind of as stymied as I was in this big metro area than I was back in a fairly smaller city back in Alabama. And until January 2019, I had a realization, and I can remember it clear as day. There was actually a very rainy, dark day. And my husband and we were on our way home from work. And since we were Atlanta commuters who spent a lot of time in traffic and in our car, we had been listening to various Linux podcasts since 2017. And it was almost 2 years later that I heard the first female guest on any of these podcasts. And I was thinking, man, it would be great to have more voices like hers on these podcasts. And then there was this little thought, and it's like, well, if you want that to be true, shouldn't you at least try to be one of them? And it was then that I began my career switch into tech. And so my first tack was kind of find, well, where do I fit? My husband had gone in via kind of the tech support route, but I knew that just didn't quite feel like where I fit. So I threw myself into self-learning. We're still on the introduction. So I threw myself into self-learning since we looked at a boot camp and then quickly didn't, as the price range was expensive. But I found my way into data analytics. It felt kind of like a history type thing with the research just a little more quantitative than qualitative. And I actually started volunteering as a very, very painfully new kind of data analyst at a data analytics nonprofit, and eventually even becoming an interim head of advocacy there when our need for speakers just went through the roof, and we had no one to coordinate all of those things. And I really enjoyed that. And I also began learning Linux and getting more involved in the open source community around this time. Things were usually really quiet at the tutoring center. It was either usually manic or nobody there for days. So I started working on a Cisco Linux Fundamentals course. I was now running Ubuntu Mate on my computer at home, and I'd kind of joined my first virtual Linux user group in the Ubuntu Podcast Telegram group. And so I kept on kind of growing these skills, growing a bit of confidence here. And at the end of 2019, there was a learning engineer position open at Canonical, where I currently work now. And I thought, why not? I use Ubuntu. I've designed courses, history courses, but still courses. And I'm a reasonably good communicator. To my enormous shock, I was invited for an interview. And even though I didn't get the position, it was a very exciting and positive experience. I emailed the head of the hiring team, and I thanked him, and I asked him what I could do to be a stronger candidate. And he gave me the best advice anyone could have given me in 2020, and that was to get involved in the community. So I approached a friend that I had made through that Telegram group, my friend Bill, and he was on the Ubuntu Mate team. And I said, hey, I'm good at writing, I'm good at editing, and I like to learn new things. And if the team could use any of those skills, then I would be happy to help. And it turned out that we were refreshing our website. And yes, it could use someone to help rewrite and refresh old information and to write new sections. And this is where my career change started to warm up. So first cup, finding your niche. This was on the 29th of June, 2020 at the first of many virtual conferences, which in this case was the Open Source Summit North America, and this was a cup of Yorkshire Gold. So this was my first open source conference that I attended, not only personally, but on behalf of an open source project. In this case, I had asked our project lead if I could attend with the words Ubuntu Mate after my name, and he said yes. And so this morning I had a lot of excitement, a very chatty Slack, and in my case I had a very large cup of Yorkshire Gold, which is my go-to tea to have when I have a long day because it keeps me going. A few weeks prior to this, a few things had happened. I had submitted a proposal for the Google season of Docs. And in this case, the proposal was for a new volunteer guide for OpenMRS, which is the leading open source enterprise electronic medical records platform. One of the sections that I'd enjoyed writing for the new Ubuntu Mate website were our history, where I ended with an invitation for people to join the history yet to be made, and our get involved sections. So when I saw that OpenMRS was asking for help with their contributor onboarding, I knew I wanted to apply. But I wanted my proposal to be as strong as possible. And so at a friend's suggestion, I had asked, it's like, hey, can you recommend, how to write better onboarding docs? He said to reach out to John O'Bacon, and I did. And so he had been our first community manager and had gone on to write a book all about communities called People Powered. So I emailed him and mentioned the friend who had introduced me and asked hey, is there an open source project that he thought had exceptional onboarding documentation? And he replied, with his recommendations, and also a link to an article that summed up his suggestions and tips for new community member guides. And he was hosting his community leadership track at the Open Source Summit. And this was the main reason that I attended. And the community leadership track, their Slack channel, from the moment I logged on, had so much energy and collaboration. And it actually started this collaborative notes endeavor, which I've used in other places. It's fantastic. And it's not an exaggeration to state that finding an entire aspect of open source that was focused on the communities themselves, to promoting sustainable growth, improving community processes, mitigating contributor burnout. This track helped me find my niche. Writing documentation was something that I really enjoyed, but writing it about things like burning ISOs didn't quite excite me the way that contribution guides did. And now I found this group of people talking about using metrics and data, which goes back to my first kind of dip into the tech world, and things from my career as a grad student, like Benedict Anderson's Imagine Communities. I couldn't tell you how happy I was to have these combination of things happening in these conversations on the Slack. And I think that was the first spark of really wanting to do this and feeling that I found a place where I fit. So the conference, it ran for about 4 or 5 days. It was great. There were a lot more cups of tea. I had some Austin-themed food in honor of the intended location for the conference. And I left it excited about putting kind of what I had learned over the past few days into action, both for Ubuntu Mate and OpenMRS, if my Google Season of Docs project got picked. Oh, and one more thing that happened before that conference. 2 weeks before it, I had submitted my application for the Ubuntu Community Representative. Second cup, throw a party. This is the 13th of November, 2020 at Virtual Seagull. And the tea was Kim B Spice Ceylon Black Tea. So it's a few months afterward. Shortly after the Open Source Summit, my friend Bill had posted a picture of his newly acquired copy of People Powered on Twitter, and he tagged Jono. And I helped turn that offhand reply. Okay, if we can kind of restart the tape here with tape 2, I kind of got a bit lost. So anyway, so this will be the start for the second slide. Cup 2, throw a party. So the next notable cup in this career transformation, in this career switch, happened in mid-November. But I need to kind of bring you up to speed on what had happened between that and the previous cup. So shortly after the Open Source Summit, my friend Bill from the Ubuntu Mate team managed to get a copy of People Powered, and he posted a picture of it on Twitter and tagged Jono. And I made this offhand comment about, hey, we should start a book club, meaning me and Bill reading the book, just the two of us, and talking about, all the ideas there. Well, Jono answered and said, I'd be willing to do something for People Powered. And that offhand reply became a book club that at its start had over 200 people signed up from communities all over the world in all sorts of industries, tech and otherwise. And so we had been getting together, we got together for 11 weeks, and we had just passed our halfway point by the time that this second cup happened. And it was a fantastic group of people getting together twice per week with Jono to talk about communities and how we made them, and for many of us, how we made them better. I hadn't gotten picked for Google season of docs, but I was still working on the project that I'd proposed anyway, writing an easy to follow and easy to maintain guide for new volunteers to OpenMRS. And I'd been meeting every Tuesday morning just about with a welcoming and supportive documentation team. And I was just kind of putting the final polishes on this guide in preparation for our implementers meeting in a few weeks thereafter. I was also in the middle of planning the second quarterly meetup of reps from different Ubuntu flavors, which was a kind of a casual meetup to help us find areas where we could coordinate and help each other. And this was our second meeting after having a successful one in August. And speaking of meetings, I had also helped relaunch regular monthly meetings for Ubuntu Mate. So by this point, I was fairly good at chasing people down very cheerfully and mostly effectively with links to doodle polls saying, hey, we need to meet. What time is good for everyone, with people in time zones literally around the globe. And one of the things that gave me time to do all of this is that I left my part-time underpaid tutoring job in August when our college decided to force all staff back, no matter what their risk status was. And so I just said no. And we were able to live on just one income for that point. And it gave me more time for these projects, even if I had to do kind of a lot of late night tutoring. So I was still bringing some money in. And so I had more time for projects, more times for meetings, and more time for open source tea parties. And so, yes, there are non-metaphorical cups of tea in this story too. And better yet, they're non-metaphorical cups with other people. So the first tea party was for Guadic, which is the annual meeting for the GNOME project. Like many other meetings, they had gone virtual this past year. And so I decided, well, I don't have to travel. A lot of these were free. I'm going to go to as many of these conferences as I can that are related to my interest. So in the registration form, they asked if you were interested in hosting any social events. And I mentioned that I would be willing to do anything like an Animal Crossing meetup. They didn't go for that one. And a tea party. They did email me and say, tell us more about the tea party. It was a fantastic time. We all brought our favorite cups of tea. We had fancy hats, including one person who put on a fantastic solo fancy hat show. And this was part of an amazing social lineup that they had, along with a cocktail mocktail hour, a cooking class, a jam band, and even an impromptu pet parade. And that tea party led to another tea party. Because as I was finding out, these open source networks are all rather interconnected. And even if this is mostly true because open source contributors I'm find it really hard to limit themselves to just contribute to one thing. So one of the people involved with Guadic was also involved with a community conference called Seagull, which is a free and open source conference usually held in Seattle. And they asked me to help transition Teagle, which is their annual, for the past 3 years, free-for-all tea swap, into the digital realm. And so normally what happens is people would come and they'd bring some of their extra favorite tea, put it on a table, and that Saturday people would just try different teas, sit, chat, and just generally have a good time. So I helped organize most privacy conscientious, Secret Santa style online tea swap of 2020 and possibly ever, and a party to go with it actually too. And this was a chance for the Seagull organizers and the attendees from across open source to take a moment in an extraordinarily stressful month of a year that wore out the term unprecedented, to have a welcome break with a cup of tea and with old and new friends. And this was just, it happened exactly when we needed it the most. My gifter sent me a box of delicious spice black tea from Kimby's, which is, I think, in the Carolinas. And it has become my go-to kind of chai whenever my husband and I get Indian takeout, which is at least once a week, if I'm being honest. But these projects, especially Teagle and the book club, did two things. First, it helped me meet people across the tech industry and open source, and to get to know them sorry, I have a bit of a speech problem too. It helped me meet people across the tech industry and open source, and to get to know them in meaningful, sustainable ways. Last year was supposed to be the year of the Linux conference for me and my husband, but virtual conferences, especially these community organized ones, mean that whenever in-person meetings can happen again, we're not going to be total strangers, at least to some of the people there. And besides building up these professional networks, for example, one of the Seagull organizers is a member of the leadership for Fedora. And so I have this wonderful person that I can talk to over a cup of tea about the joys and challenges of open source communities. But also these events focused around bringing people together did something else that I think for my career switch was even more important, that they helped me stay focused and organized while the world outside our apartment was just falling apart. And so regular meetings and deadlines helped mitigate my stress and channel it into something useful, into being part of a team where my contributions were important for things that other people were counting on or otherwise looking forward to, whether that's a book club or a tea exchange or new volunteer documentation. And other people in these networks that you grow are going to notice that you stay organized and on top of things. And these people one day might even be the ones who are considering you when your resume comes across their desk. Which brings us to Cup 3. So in late December, the email I had been hoping for half of the year finally got in my inbox. And this was the interview availability email from Canonical. And the first person I interviewed with was my project lead for Ubuntu Mate. My second interview was with a Canonical employee who had been a Twitter mutual for the previous few months. I had no idea that either of them would be involved with the process when I applied in June. Finding a position through coming up in the community is never a sure thing. But if anything, I think it was what I did after I submitted an application 2 weeks before the open source summit that made the difference. I stayed active and I branched out from my individual part of the Ubuntu community into strengthening the connections and collaboration between other parts, which in this case was the flavors. I went through the process to become an Ubuntu member in December, which involved assessing my past contributions and my future goals, as well as gathering testimonials from other members of the community. Also dealing with SSH keys, but that's a whole different story. I also built networks outside the Ubuntu community, connected by common caffeinated threads and talking about books and the ideas within them. And through it all, I was always myself, energetic, excited, a little bit too into tea and themed food, always happy to cheer others on and find ways to bring people together to make awesome things happen. Open source contributing helped me become my best self, and to be that best self in this almost fearlessly public way. And that brings us to the third and last cup for now. It was my second day at work, and one of the women from the desktop team invited me for tea and a chat, so I knew I liked her already. We spent the first few minutes not chatting about work, but fantasy novels and memorable trips. I told her that the tea I was drinking came from a tea shop in Barcelona for my last trip to Europe in 2017. Before we kind of did start to talk about those work things, she let me know all the things that she'd wished that she'd known when she got started. And then we started talking about her thoughts on how to help reignite and strengthen our community. And I knew that this was just the first of many cups to come, both whether it is on a Google Meet or one day in some fantastic tea shop in an international destination in person. And so for any of you watching this, especially those of you who aren't a friend or family member, but you're watching this because you're considering a career change or you've just started, I hope that this helps you find your first cup and find the place you want to be, to get people together for an amazing party or two, pinkies up, and to cheer and encourage you when the place you want to be finally becomes the place you are. So to you, cheers.